Language makes infinite use of finite means, I think is very pertinent. It was expressed by a Prussian philosopher several hundred years ago. Uh, but as you can see, it's extremely pertinent in today's day and age as we see the advent of these large language models, conversational models, and the use of language and how we use the language, how it generates language is very much in focus here over the last year in particular. So with that sort of mental image, we can talk just on a high level about prompt engineering. Very simply, crafting language inputs for models in an effort to produce optimal language outputs. That's a little bit of a different cast that I put on this, and specifically inserting the word language here. We're going to dwell in this presentation quite a bit on mastering language and what effect that might have on our outputs as far as the model is concerned. In prompt engineering, you've heard this many times, context is key. I introduce a term that is not used often, which is pragmatics, which is the study of context. It's a subfield of linguistics, and it's concerned specifically with how context contributes to meaning. And considering that these large language models are conversational, this is a very important point and something that we've been exploring, me personally also, quite a bit as far as these models are concerned. My sense is that prompt engineering is going to wane over time. I think as these models become more capable as agents, and then once issued a directive, the models will become better and better at inferring the context and proceeding with generating the desired outcome that you're hoping to see from the model. Some technique examples. I'm not going to dwell on this a lot because I think many of you come across this. Few shot prompting, where you provide examples in the context window in an effort to teach the model, so to speak, how you want it to respond. Chain of thought, which was the subject of a famous paper, where you guide the large language model to think step by step. And I think the most popular one, which is flattery role assignment. You ask the model to act like an expert of some kind or other in an effort to get the output you're looking for. I'm going to dwell on this one a lot. So just keep act like in your mind as we move along here, because we're going to explore that a little bit further. The first paper I wrote, the most recent paper, I should say, that I wrote on Medium introduces this idea of contextual scaffolds. And we're going to start here as far as creating a framework for going from prompt engineering to program simulation to then diving into creating your own custom GPTs. And in this article, which you'll find on Towards Data Science in Medium, we define a few concepts that are really pertinent. The first is this idea of a meaning aura. And what we mean by that is the implicit definitions, implicatures, connotations, and sentiment admitted by every linguistic expression. And that's what makes language both powerful and, in the context of a large language model like ChatGPT, challenging, because it begs the question, what do you tell the model? How do you phrase it? What words do you use? What meaning does those words carry? And they can have a significant impact on what you get as an output. And I think that's part of where the frustration comes from for some folks who just don't know what to say. What do I tell this model in order to get it to do what I want? Additionally, in the article, I should say, we talk about breaking down your prompts into scaffolds and defining an expectational context scaffold, your expectations vis-a-vis what you want the model to produce, versus the operational context scaffold, which is how you tell the model to operate as far as meeting those expectations that you have. If this sort of resonates with you, it's a good article that, again, just clearly creates a mental model around how to approach your prompt engineering. So let's peer through this linguistic kaleidoscope, and specifically, let's investigate this idea of the meaning aura and what it might tell us about how we should do prompt engineering, and then that'll lead into why program simulation is particularly effective. So, a question: do act like and behave like imply the same thing? So, remember, one of the really key techniques out there is this idea of acting like an expert, act like a Pulitzer Prize winning author and help me write something, act like a Twitter guru that can create engaging Twitter posts, right? It's by far the most used technique, but why not say behave like? Well, why would that not necessarily be more effective, or is it the same thing? So let's unpack this a little bit further, because this really helps us get to the idea of the pragmatics and the meaning auras of phrases and words and any linguistic expression. So in using act like, we're telling someone or something, in this case, ChatGPT, to adopt characteristics or mannerisms of someone or something. And the implication here is that it's temporary, it's superficial. We're not asking it to behave consistently. We're just saying act like, right? I think it is intuitive for all of us, but not maybe at sort of at first glance, right? Our brains are taught to sort of create shortcuts and just react to the context quickly so that we know the situation and the environment. And so until you really think about it, and then from there you can extend. Well, an actor who acts like a character is not that character. They're adopting these characteristics. The connotation is in fact artificial, theatrical, carries a pretense of role playing. Now, act like does work with ChatGPT, but just let's follow along this path here to see why language really does matter uh, when we're creating prompts. Behave like would suggest conducting oneself in a manner that's consistent with the characteristics of something or something, suggesting more of a sense of authenticity, real reflection. The suggest really suggests that the output should be reflective of the individual or entity's true nature. But again, it's only a reflection, right? It's behave like. It's really a suggestion in some respects, as opposed to an actual directive. So I'm going to contrast this now with a third concept or phrase: you are, right? You are is a direct statement of identity or state of being. I don't think anyone would argue that this is declarative. It suggests permanence and authenticity. In the case of a model, we're implying a full and immediate adoption of the characteristics of the persona or entity is expected. From a prompt engineering guidance perspective, it's sort of surprising to me that folks that do this and purport to have expertise aren't suggesting to people that you should use "you are this expert." And because the model is in essence modeling all of these implicatures and meaning R's in the background itself, because we have this meaning R associated with just these simple two words, you would expect this to be a very effective way of telling the model or setting the stage or establishing the context. However it is that you want to think about it, this would seem to be, out of those three choices, the best to proceed with. So let's do some compare and contrast, right? Superficiality versus depth. Act like, which is the most popular, probably more surface oriented. Imitation. Behave like probably suggests a deeper adherence to certain norms or certain expectations. You are asserts an intrinsic quality, right? There's no ambiguity there. You are an expert Pulitzer Prize winning author, right? There's no ambiguity at that point from the model's perspective as far as how it's supposed to operate. There's a temporal aspect. Act like, behave like can suggest it's temporary, whereas you are, again, is a permanent state implied within that meaning aura. Impact on identity. Act like is probably the least tied to identity. You're acting like someone and it's temporary. Behave like, maybe a little bit of a notch higher, but again, you are inexplicably tied to the identity or nature of the entity or subject in question. And then finally, and I've starred this one, instruction versus declaration. Act like and behave like tend to feel more instructional, guiding the model, for example, to a desired behavior, contrasted with if you tell the model you are, that's declarative and you're stating something that you want the model to perceive to be fact. And so you want the model to be consistent and you don't want the model to potentially introduce any sort of variability with respect to what it's doing. So the advice here is consider being declarative in your directives. I think you are is a more effective phrase because it tends to condition you to use other language that's associated with that tends to be more declarative. And behave like and act like tend to be aligned more with phrases such as you should. Because if you're telling someone to sort of act superficially or temporarily, and I find, I sort of discovered myself doing this. I would tell the model, you should write a story, or I'm hoping, and the model, especially GPT-4, is extremely effective even in these circumstances. But at the end of the day, you want to end up in a scenario where you're writing your prompts with language such as you are, you will do this, you will produce this kind of output, and being much more declarative with respect to how you want the language to behave, the model, I should say, to behave. So along these lines, there is a now custom GPT that I've put out there called the Meaning R Assistant Program. I think it's pretty fascinating. I have it loaded up. We'll take a look at it later if there's a little bit of time. But it's pretty fascinating when you sort of take different terms that could be used for something within a model's context and then load them up into this custom GPT and see what the differences are. And it's typically extremely enlightening as you're writing prompts, especially if you intend to write custom GPTs where the instruction is going to be utilized again and again. And in this case, you'll want to refine the language that you're using in the prompt and loading it into the custom GPT later. So what's the meaning R of program, right? Let's dive now into program simulation. The meaning R of program, just that singular word, could be a set of instructions for a computer, a planned series of events, or a broadcast on television or radio, right? So you see this kaleidoscopic effective language, depending on how we're using the word program, it actually could end up meaning different things. It implies planning, structure, consistency, dependability. In a technological context, it might even suggest sophistication, automation, complexity, and may evoke feelings of innovation and efficiency, right? So this, when we look at the meaning R of program, this word, it feels like it would be a great word to potentially use to have the large language model create an environment that produces outputs that are consistent, structured, sophisticated, utilize techniques. Like program just really checks a lot of boxes for what we would want the model to do in an effort to produce the output we're looking for. Now let's contrast this a tiny bit with the meaning R of a self-assembling program, right? So we've added just a very simple term. And now when we say self-assembling, the ambiguity around what program is referring to tends to go away, right? This likely is a software system that autonomously organizes. And this idea of self-assembling carries this implicature and connotation that the program should adapt, evolve, or configure itself to meet specific objectives or respond to certain conditions and demonstrate a level of autonomy and self-management, right? So that feels like would be helpful. We have a prompt or a custom GPT that behaves like a self-assembling program or that is a self-assembling program. That feels like it might be something that might be useful. implies a high level of technological sophistication, conveys a level of intelligence with respect to the system. I mean, if it's able to self assemble, the implication or the connotation, I should say, is one of intelligence. And we know, of course, that the models are not intelligent. We're not going to have that debate on a metaphysical level here. But from the just casting this from the perspective of the meaning aura, that is the connotation. And again, if we believe that on some level, a large language model with billions of parameters has implicitly modeled these meaning auras, this conveyance of a connotation of intelligence might be something we want the model to do. Even if it's just mimicking intelligence, we're looking for it to be smart in the production of its outputs. We're looking for ways to measure this. To be honest, there's a lot of concepts here that could be unpacked with some additional research. I haven't seen a ton of research in this area. Everyone's sort of focused on these benchmarks and leaderboards and things like that. And I do think some of the research really ought to push into this area of pragmatics, because it's the language that really holds the key to mastering prompt engineering, in my opinion. Not so much having any specific recipe, but just mastering language and keeping in mind this concept of the meaning aura. What do these words mean, or what does this phrase imply? What is the connotation of this word or words? Really having a fine grasp of that really can just unlock some really powerful prompt engineering, as you'll see with program simulation. So program simulation probably lives somewhere in the flattery, role assignment, instruction-based area, but it has all these additional layers of, because of the implicatures and what the idea of a program or self-assembling program carries, it really goes beyond that, in my opinion, and becomes a technique that I think is in some ways superior to either of those. And in the article, and there's a couple of articles on the topic on Medium, again published in Towards Data Science. We in one of the articles we look at dimensionalizing this technique in a way that you can then create something that's structured and pre-configured, where you define most of the functions and how the program is supposed to behave, so to speak, versus an unstructured self-configuring program that you simply tell the model you are a program that writes children's stories, but you can self-assemble yourself, you can define the functions, right, and sort of give the model this tremendous amount of discretion in terms of how to, in fact, go about producing the outputs. And it's a very powerful technique because, if you're interested in that article, as you'll see in the article, the prompt is just a few sentences long, and it launches into this very sophisticated and complex program that is able to produce outputs in line with what we were hoping to accomplish. So that really is, again, at the fully autonomous behavior and self-configuration end of the spectrum. But you might find instances where you want to really just specifically tell the model exactly how it should behave and what the function should do. And we've seen great success with using the technique for a variety of different things. Here's an example of a mind mapping program simulation prompt, right? You are a self-assembling program whose purpose is to create mind maps for users. And in this case, we're using the structured pre-configured approach. As you can see, what follows here are a definition of the core functions of this program in quotes. And if we step away and now go to the contextual scaffolds frameworks, this is the operational context scaffold. Now in the article, I sort of reverse the order. I start with the expectations and then move on to the operational context scaffold. But there's no reason why you can't do it in this way. And I think with program simulation, actually sort of reversing the order is maybe a little bit more effective, because you can just really start with what you want to see. And in this case, it's we want to see mind maps, And the operating context for the model is you are a self-assembling program that creates them. Simple as that. Interestingly, we could stop there and then tell the model to self-configure, et cetera, and it'll produce a viable interaction conversation that'll produce mind maps for you. Maybe not the exact way you'd want, and that's why you might then consider what we did here, which is really defining a lot of the functions a little bit more closely. So on the next part of the prompt here, the functions continue, and then we end up on our expectational context scaffold, which is you will run the remainder of the dialogue as a program. That's my expectations. That's what I want the model to produce. And notice, going back to that aside a bit, everything here is you will. You are a self-assembling program. You will present the existing nodes for the mind map. You will do these things. And again, what probably is going to be an area of research here soon for me in particular. I don't see why you'd want to use any other kind of language in this scenario. There was a recent paper that sort of showed the emotive context or the power of introducing emotion into your prompts to tell the model to breathe, tell the model that you have lots of confidence and you're really happy. And yes, maybe that could be effective, but I think something like this is just cut to the chase. Tell the model exactly what you're trying to get. The model doesn't have feelings. It understands the impact of emotions. And so again, going back to meaning auras, if you tell the model you really are counting on the model to produce the output, it understands the meaning aura around that emotional configuration that you're dropping in. But sometimes it's just best to start with what's most important, in my opinion, which is telling the model exactly what you expect to see from it. And so with this particular program simulation prompt, you can see here, this is what ChatGPT 4 produces. Um, we really didn't specify a ton here beyond these functions. And if you go through and sort of interact with the menu here, it will produce the output that you're looking for. This works in actually 3.5. So I've been testing some of these in 3.5 because to the extent that people don't have ChatGPT Plus or Pro or whatever the paid version is, this one in particular does work. It's not as consistent in terms of adding emojis and things like that, but it works pretty well in 3.5 as well. Additionally, this is now available as a custom GPT, which is what we're going to show you. How do you turn this, which was a regular prompt that you could use, into a custom GPT? So let's talk a little bit about OpenAI Dev Day, because that's when custom GPTs were announced. I think a lot of folks were surprised about the functionality that was announced, or they weren't expecting it completely. And it's only really been a couple of weeks and lots of fanfare around it, that this really is the app store moment for OpenAI. Granted, now over the weekend, there's been a number of other amazing, tremendous developments. It's like the drama almost never stops at OpenAI, but we'll see. I agree with the profundity of what's been announced, because it does move ChatGPT in particular in a direction that very much aligned with program simulation. And when the article was written and you were having some interactions with the community, these are the things that we all alluded to, like, wow, I wish we could have multiple custom instructions and create little programs that I could then have a home for so that they could be utilized again. The nice thing about the marketplace is that these custom GPTs are available for others to use to the extent that you want to publish them and make them public. So how do we turn that mind map assistant into a custom GPT? For those that are not familiar with the custom GPT interface, it's pretty straightforward. What I'm showing here is the manual configuration. The create, which is grayed out here, is a dialogue different than ChatGPT that you can use in natural language to define your custom GPT and assistant. And in this case, I went with the one that you can manually configure. Before I jump along here, let me see. I think we got a question. So, question from Raj: if you're building a product using OpenAI as part of your core stack, how would you minimize the risk? That's a question that's on everyone's mind as a result of what happened over the weekend. You know what, Raj? I'll address that at the end, if you don't mind. Let's continue with the custom GPT, but I'll address that as well because that's something that we've been thinking about as well. So pretty straightforward interface here. Um, we have this notion of conversation starters. You can see the red arrow there. And so this is optional, but to the extent that you want to introduce things for people to load into the model from a prompt perspective right out of the gate, and things that you're not sure if they're going to know how to articulate on their own, and you just want to give examples, you do that. And in this case, we just added a conversation starter called Launch Mind Map Assistant Program. There's some other features associated with the custom GPT's knowledge. So you can upload files, and this utilizes the RAG, retrieval augmented generation, to either do Q&A with a file or use that file as a knowledge base to answer questions, right? So this is new flexibility that's been added. There's a ton of discussion and development using RAG, specifically the LangChain libraries became famous because of the capabilities with RAG. So understandably, OpenAI just dropped that functionality in these custom GPTs. The only problem with it is no one really knows exactly how it works. And so for developers, that's not the greatest thing in the world. But for our own custom use cases, we might find that it's helpful to introduce some external knowledge or something for the model to utilize in the context of the custom GPT. Additionally, you can toggle on and off capabilities like web browsing, image generation, and code interpreter, which generates code. I unclicked the code interpreter. I don't particularly see the relevance for this mind map assistant, but I left DALL-E on because maybe we can generate a visual image of the mind map. And so I thought that would be interesting to sort of leave checked. Of course, you can leave all of these checked on if you prefer, but I thought I'd uncheck one to sort of point out that some may or may not be particularly relevant. And create new action, we're not going to dive into that, but that's effectively creating custom actions within the context of the custom GPT, and really the domain of something that's a little bit more software engineering centric, but again, unlocking additional capabilities and powers where I think the example that they use is you want to get the current weather or something and drop that into the model. Well, you can create a custom action that pushes something through an API and maybe retrieves something and brings it back into your custom GPT. So you have quite a lot of flexibility and power, not excessive by any stretch of the imagination. This interface is very straightforward in terms of what to do. And to the extent that you want to simplify it even further, you can always use that natural language interface where you just talk to ChatGPT itself and it does the configuration for you. So what did I change in the language of the prompt in order to fit this into a custom GPT? So the only thing that's really different, there's really just two things. Here's the first. You are a self-assembling program named Mind Map Assistant Program. That's it. The rest of the functions and definitions here are the same. The second thing that was changed is at the very end of the prompt, it says, your first completion will provide an inspiring welcome message and ask the user to make a selection from the menu. That's it. So if you had successfully or have been using the technique program simulation for other things and want to recast this for a custom GPT, these couple of tweaks, because again, custom GPTs, as opposed to having this free form prompt completion interaction like you did in chat GPT 4, in this case, it wants a set of instructions that define how the custom GPT is behaved. And so this behaves. So these particular tweaks just sort of steer the prompt into a set of instructions that now can be utilized by the custom GPT to produce the output. So why don't we take a look at the mind map assistant, right? That's a QR code to, it's public. The unfortunate thing with public is you can use it, but you can't see what's behind underneath the hood, so to speak. But we'll do that now so that everybody can take a look. So let me just switch here. And interestingly, 2 weeks ago, when we did the presentation, OpenAI had the major outage. And custom GPTs weren't even yet available. So we were going to take a look at the playground, which has some similar functionality. All right, so Mind Map Assistant, right? Custom GPT, launch Mind Map Assistant program. So there you have it. There's the menu. It's consistent with the menu that we defined. We can create a new mind map. We can add a node, enrich a node, delete a node. Something that would be almost impossible to create in your own application. So a software developer could easily create this. It would take a lot of effort, but what they would have a very difficult time producing is this ability to get brilliant observations and insights based on the mind map, which would require this functionality and all these algorithms around retrieving insights and external observations on the mind map that's been created, right? So all of a sudden, we actually have a program that would be really difficult to create using a traditional software engineering approach. Doable, but extremely difficult. So let's just take a look at the GPT itself, right? So here's the create that I mentioned. I didn't use that. And frankly, I think the configure menu and setup is just so intuitive and straightforward that it's likely not necessarily that helpful to have this sort of collaborative conversation in order to come up with a name and the instructions that we covered. And there you go. And here was that function for the creating genius insights. You will provide overarching observations that are formulated by a genius polymath who analyzes the mind map. This functionality is dramatic, right? Think about what it would take to create that sort of functionality to program. And we were able to do it here with one sentence. Now, is it really good or not? That would be the subject of different interpretations. But just the fact that we can even do that really should be, for me, it's sort of mind blowing that we now have this sort of integration layer with these types of capabilities on a, really is 6 fields that we have to complete. There's your conversation starters, and there's the rest of the functions, and that's it. That's all you need to do in order to create your custom GPT. So while we're at it, it looks like we're moving along pretty well. Let's take a look at the Meaning R Assistant program. So this is an assistant that helps you unearth the implicit definitions, implicatures, connotations, etc. Here's one that's preloaded that I think is pretty powerful. Compare and contrast the meaning auras of those phrases that we examined. And the Meaning R Assistant will go in and help you decipher, do a compare and contrast as to what the meaning auras are and how you might want to then utilize that information in respect of what you're trying to create from a prompt perspective. Let's see what comes up at the end here. Yeah, so in comparison, it's what we talked about in the presentation, act like and behave like both refer to the emulation of behavior, but they differ in depth. You are stands apart by affirming an inherent trait or identity. Again, this is nothing that is anything but common sense, but sometimes you're not going to go look at the dictionary or do your own analysis on the words you're using. So this is a quick little custom GPT assistant that can help you make these comparisons or investigate a specific meaning or a little bit more closely. Go ahead, RJ.
Okay, so my question is, you pointed out that language and et cetera is very important for the use of this approach. And so you had to craft using language the instructions for the large language model to follow. And my question is, did you perhaps take advantage of like the Meaning Aura program to actually get it to interpret your individual commands that you use to create the prompt? So this way you'd have a better idea of what latent space you're activating by wording a particular prompt in a particular way.
I did not, but that's a great question, and that's very much the direction that we're hoping to go with some of this. And the words you use, this activation of a latent space, or just activation in general, I think is really apt, right? Because act like sort of activates one contextual domain, whereas UR activates another. And of course, you need UR and then something specific, but UR something specific then activates another domain of sort of context. And so, is there a way to take this concept of the meaning auras and have the model sort of navigate its way to the optimal language that should be utilized? And I think that I've seen papers talk about how ChatGPT itself is a better prompt engineer than us humans. That sort of a loose conclusion. I'm not sure it's 100% reliable, but I think utilizing these types of concepts, we might be able to actually get to a scenario where the model itself is just, again, that's why I think prompt engineering wanes over time, because the prompt engineering is going to become embedded in somehow within the functionality, so that you start with your context, what you want, and then the model can sort of use this type of an approach or framework to navigate its way to the appropriate language, create the outputs. Maybe there's some agentic orchestration where outputs from different models are utilized in tandem to do different things. I do believe all this stuff is coming. So let me go back to the presentation now. Let me talk a little bit more about a couple more concepts. And everyone, feel free to jump in if there's any questions. Okay. So for the more developmentally oriented folks out there that like to tinker and or software developers, there's some things in the Assistance API functionality that I think really aligns well with program simulation. They're not on that front end custom GPT for the most part, but I would not be surprised to see some of that functionality migrate its way there. One of them being JSON mode. One of the qualms, one of the things that a lot of the developers are looking for is structured outputs. So outputs. So in the case of, think about how this aligns well with program simulation. If you have a program simulation prompt, there might be a function you have where the output of that function is supposed to be structured in a very specific way. Well, if you can get that consistently, that would be a pretty powerful extension of this base technique of program simulation. The other one that I've starred is this idea of reproducible outputs. And you can see here, I pulled this from the docs. Chat completions are not deterministic, meaning I will get something different each time, even if the prompt was exact. If I use the exact same language inputs, I'll get different language outputs. And I really have not seen this one talked a lot about, but I think there's a lot of power in this one as people, as developers start to investigate this idea of receiving mostly deterministic outputs by setting a seed parameter. And so one of the things that came up as we introduced program simulation back in August, a lot of people were sort of blown away that it could do this. The model, like, wow, the model could do something like this. And the question of whether or not program state could be maintained kept coming up. Well, this would suggest that you could hold program state if we are able to set some kind of seed parameter that's associated with the deterministic output of the program or in stages. I haven't really looked into this too much. I don't know if this is at the inception of the conversation or if you can invoke deterministic outputs halfway down the dialogue, right? I haven't really had a chance to look into this too much, but in my mind, this could be an extremely effective and powerful overlap with program simulation. Near-term functionality, I'm hoping for, again, reproducible outputs in the custom GPT. So I'm hoping that functionality actually makes its way to the front end. Conversation forking, I think, is something that should be introduced, and we will potentially see where you can take basically maybe toggle on some feature that says, I want two possibilities. And we know the model actually does that, right? What you're seeing is a top, basically the top output that's amongst many outputs. So maybe you could see the top two and fork and proceed along the path of one of those and then come back and maybe proceed along the lines of the other. Context pruning and summarization. So again, in the API, they introduced this idea of threads, which basically allows for an infinite context window, but the context pruning is just whatever's oldest gets eliminated, and you can continue beyond the 128,000 if you're using 4 Turbo. I'd like to see some ability to actually do that manually so that you can eliminate or summarize some piece of the conversation or context and now extend the context window beyond that. Multiple GPT orchestration and some kind of intelligent conversation retrieval, I think, needs to be introduced here as well. Go ahead.
It was regarding the seed parameter. Have you done any kind of benchmarking as to how deterministic the output remains over a period of time? Because in one of the GPTs I have, despite putting the seed parameter, somehow the output seems to differ. So just wanted to.
I haven't had a chance to look at this at all. It's interesting in the docs here, they say to receive mostly deterministic outputs. But to your point, what does mostly mean in this case? And are there other environmental considerations that are going to affect how deterministic the output is? Now, if it's able to hold a menu, right, in program simulation, we hold that menu without this feature. And maybe it really becomes sort of dependent on the type of context in question. But yeah, investigating this and then potentially looking at variability and how to control that variability with maybe some specific, like some techniques, is definitely something to think about.
And on the same topic, for us dummies, could you please just in a nutshell explain what the seed parameter is? That's totally new to me in this context.
Yes. A seed parameter is very simply, if you're looking for random, let's say you want to randomly generate words. And so you have a random generator of some kind, and it produces words randomly. Well, many of those generators have the ability to, for the sake of reproducing outputs, you set a parameter, a seed that says, well, I want the same word to be generated in this case all the time. And that is going to be associated with the number 2. And so you set that seed parameter to 2. And now every time you ask that part of your program to generate a word, it's going to generate the same word. It's functionality that's sort of baked in to these random generators for the sake of being able to reproduce an output that would otherwise be seemingly random. So you want it to be random, but you want it to be reproduced.
I think I've seen this with image generation before with LLMs, but I didn't realize it could be used in other ways. So how would one actually do that in, in a text-based system? Is that functionality already exist?
So it does exist. As you can see, I pulled that right from the docs. It's in beta, but it's only available in the API. So at the moment, it's only available to the developers that develop applications that use the OpenAI API, have the ability to use this functionality. And it's probably, they released it there so that they can see how people end up using it before they determine how and if they allow that functionality to be brought into the front end. And in particular, you would probably see it in the custom GPTs, right? If these are things that are supposed to persist and exist over time, then there might be, and I do believe there's a place for reproducible outputs in the context of these custom GPTs, but that functionality isn't there yet. We haven't seen it.
Is the context of this though more for like regeneration within an existing conversation, or is it also somehow helpful in a totally new conversation, use the same seed? I would think it would be just within one conversation.
Yeah, I would guess that's where it's most pertinent. And the one I could just sort of make a mental connection to easily was this idea of program simulation. If you want some function to do something specific, you might take advantage of this type of functionality to say, well, no, this particular function does a specific thing or produces a specific output, and I want that output to be the same every time, or mostly the same, as you can see here. They've outlined that I guess it's probably practically impossible for them to make it 100% reliably deterministic, right? And that's why, the holding the state of program or holding program state with simulation like this is not for any sort of mission critical system, because it's generative, and I doubt we're ever going to see, no, this is a 100% deterministic system that's going to produce the same behavior every time. That's still probably within the domain of traditional software engineering. But who knows? So you can never rule anything out. Raj, you had asked a question about the building a product using OpenAI as part of your core stack. I think the thing to do is you need to focus on an architecture that allows you to plug in a different model and potentially do so with minimum disruption to the front end. The latest news out of OpenAI was that there's a number of folks that have, a significant amount of people have now threatened to quit if they don't fire the board, which has been complicated by the fact that now Microsoft hired Sam Altman sort of overnight. And so there's a big concern. Anybody that's built on that API is like, oh my gosh, like, is this stuff all going to go offline at some point? Because they just, and so Microsoft invested $13 billion in OpenAI. So I would guess part of what's being done here was an effort to make sure that the ship doesn't rock too much. And that's why they just snapped up the Sam and probably anybody else that wants to go over into Microsoft. But yeah, an architecture that allows for whether it's Anthropic models or open source models, to be plugged in um, as the generative engine is probably something that's important going forward to minimize risk.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I didn't think for a second that OpenAI is going to vanish overnight. There are too many
Yeah.
stakeholders and really high level stakeholders. So that wouldn't happen. I didn't expect that to happen. Maybe some disruption or something, but didn't expect it to just disappear. I've been thinking about this ever since I started building my own product, or rather suite of products rather, and always question myself as to what happens if the people I'm relying on or the company I'm relying on changes. Not just current scenario is different, but what if they change the output of the model, or ring fence certain aspects of the model? And that's why I like wanted to get your views on what are the ways in which you are thinking, any ideas that you're working on. I wouldn't mind even sharing some of the ideas that we are working on, like micromodel architecture and fine-tuning the more open source models with using GPT-4 as more of an abstraction or orchestration layer than the inference layer or something of that kind. But just wanted to bounce some ideas and also see if there is anything that you guys are thinking about, and if you can share. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think, the architecture of the workbench is already sort of structured around plugging in a model of your choice. We're in some respects sort of model agnostic. Of course, no one wants to use any of the other models at the moment. But yeah, it's model agnostic. But to your point, if you've fine-tuned the model, this whole episode just makes everyone want to make sure we're paying attention to what's happening in the open source setting, right? Models like Mistral and some of the fine tunings that have been done that really just show tremendous promise, so that at the end of the day, if someone pulls the plug somewhere on something, then you're not stuck. And so you'd have to believe that's probably the backup plan, but it's a trade-off, right? Because we all know that 4 Turbo is the most capable model. And in fact, the recent benchmarks, it pushed ahead of 4, not by much, but to some degree, but it's substantially cheaper, right? So the cost benefit of 4 now just went through the roof because of that change in the API access cost layer. And if you're building something, it's like, well, do I mitigate risk by focusing on open source? Is that worth the trade-off in the functionality? And I would say that on average, at the moment, it's a no. I think that'll change. So I think it's important to just keep a focus on what's happening in that open source community. We might see, I would guess we're not far away from seeing models that are 4-like within 6 to 12 months. And then the question becomes, is that good enough functionality where you sort of drop your dependence on OpenAI? But, they're in a game to survive. 5, and I speculated that people thought that 5 is like 3-4 years away. I don't think 5 is 3 or 4 years away. I think ChatGPT 5 is a 2024 event. It's assuming that the current disruption at the organization didn't somehow upset the apple cart in a way that's no longer viable. But considering the race, it's like an arms race that's on. I just don't see why they'd want to allow anyone to try to catch up without stepping as far out onto the horizon as they possibly could. Everyone, have a great day.